If you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the business of lifelong learning, you're in the right place. I'm Celisa Steele.
And I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast.
So we're back with another episode of the Leading Learning Podcast. This is another CEO interview. Jeff, you had the chance to speak with Rick Grimm of NIGP, the Institute for Public Procurement.
I did, and it was a really interesting conversation. I've known Rick for years now, and I've always known that he places a very high value on learning and the role that NIGP plays with the group that it serves. And it's a really interesting profession, procurement. It's one of those things that you don't tend to think about, but as NIGP itself says, procurement is everywhere. And these are people who in local governments, in federal government, are making purchasing decisions day in and day out, really have an impact on the economy. And as you can imagine, their role has changed dramatically over the past decade or plus as new technologies have come in, and NIGP has really had to play an important role in making sure that people are learning, relearning, getting the educational experiences they need. And both Rick and his board and all of the staff take this extremely seriously. In fact, they've recently revamped their board to add a thought leader position for learning and education, so bringing in an outsider in a voting position on the board to help guide them as they go forward. So they're very serious about this. We talk just a little bit about that, and then also touch on some of the collaborations that NIGP has with academia, and then just in general about Rick's vision for learning and education and the role that NIGP needs to play going forward.
Well, I haven't yet had the good fortune to meet Rick in person, but I do know his colleague, Carol Hodes, the Executive Director of Knowledge Management at NIGP. She's very smart and funny and fun, and we're lucky because she's serving as an advisor to the Leading Learning Symposium.
Yeah, Carol is about as sharp as they come. We are extremely fortunate to have her involved in advising for the symposium and participating in the symposium. So really looking forward to that.
All right, well, enough of our banter. Let's get on to your conversation with Rick Grimm.
Hey there, this is Jeff Cobb with the Leading Learning Podcast, and I am very pleased to be joined today by Rick Grimm, who is the CEO of NIGP, the Institute for Public Procurement. Rick, welcome to Leading Learning.
Thanks, Jeff. Looking forward to the conversation.
Well, I'm really excited to have you here because I know you are an organizational leader who is really focused on learning, focused on education. It's playing a big part in how you're thinking about your organization going forward. But before we dive into that, tell us a little bit about the organization. Who is NIGP? Who do you serve? What do you do for them?
Sure. So NIGP is a institute been around for now 70 years. We celebrated our 70th anniversary just a couple months ago. And our role really is to develop, support, and promote public procurement, both domestically and globally. And by doing that, we basically are serving all levels of public sector, from federal down to state and local. And local would include special taxing districts like school districts, higher ed, special water utilities, electrical utilities, etc. And we represent about 3,000 public agencies, which then translates to about 15,000 individuals. And it's really those individuals that become the benefactors of that service to develop, support, and promote. And that's kind of the cornerstone of what we do as an organization, and certainly is part of our strategy and our mission.
And I'm sure that folks who are involved in public procurement are, like anybody else, not immune from the great amount of change that has simply been going on in our world technologically and otherwise over the past couple of decades or so. And I know from talking to you that you've come to the conclusion, you personally and your board, that really focusing in on learning and education as part of your strategy going forward, and not that it hasn't been part of the strategy before, but I think there's even more emphasis going forward, is incredibly important. So could you tell listeners a little bit about what is your vision for learning for the audience that you serve, and then how does it fit into the the overall value proposition of NIGP as an organization?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. I mean, for those of you who are not very familiar with public procurement, when you think about public spend, it's $4.3 trillion in public spend. And we think that all of that's federal and defense, but actually slightly more than half of that is state and local government. So you have a tremendous amount of spend that happens with public tax dollars. And then you translate that to, well, how do you create a prepared workforce so that people coming out of colleges and universities go through a procurement curriculum or a public procurement curriculum and they're ready to serve the cities and counties and federal government? The reality is, with that level of spend, there is literally no clear pathway for a young professional to say, I want to make a difference, I want to make a contribution to the communities that I live in, and I want to be a public procurement professional. So what has happened to us over the years, because of that lack of a formal educational process that happens in higher ed, by default, NIGP has been the developer of the body of knowledge that becomes part of the theoretical underpinnings of a prepared workforce. And of course, we're always doing it behind the curve because people come in with everything from an English degree, or maybe they have a business management degree, and then they have to go through that whole kind of reorientation about how is it different in the public sector? What are some of the goals that the public sector has in terms of providing good government to its citizenry? And so that really has been our vision, is to kind of be the stopgap over the years by providing that body of knowledge. But the new vision really is twofold. One is to shift what we have been doing as an association to the university, to the higher ed level, by creating greater, more intentional partnerships with academic communities so that we begin to look at curriculum being offered particularly within the context of a public administration degree, so that you had not only an understanding of procurement, but HR, macro finance, etc. And then for us to shift from preparing the workforce to continually, as you mentioned, the dynamics that happen in the public sector. The environment continues to change, the technology continues to change, the environment, the demands continue to change. And so our vision really is to provide that lifelong learning experience for the practitioner once they have come out of the university level.
So you're kind of reaching back into that college and university level and making sure that the preparation is maybe better there than it has been in the past. But then, like you're saying, once they get out, I mean, most people, as I say, are facing another 50 years once they're out in the workforce. You're making sure that you are kind of that dynamic force for learning as they then roll forward.
Exactly. So, a couple of the pieces that we have realized is, one, there isn't that groundswell in the university, so we need to fix that. And then secondly, we do support a certification program that really kind of is a good benchmark for individuals to understand the mastery of knowledge. But what has happened in our profession is that folks have said, once I got my professional certification, I stopped learning. And of course, my response is the day that you stop learning is the day that you're pushing the daisies up. Until then, you're talking about the 40 or 50 years that someone is a public servant, even 30 years that they're a public servant. If they get that certification program done in the first 5 or 7 years of their career, what happens to the next 23? If they don't continue to learn, they actually fall further and further behind.
Right.
So that really has to be our, as you say, the kind of the value proposition is not only having people in a prepared workforce, but continually providing that higher end skill that they need in order to maintain, the level of service that they're providing in the public sector.
Right. And this kind of reverberates throughout our entire economy, really, given the role that procurement plays. As you were highlighting earlier, there are the amounts of money at stake here. So this is an incredibly important role, I would say, for you to be playing. how does it fit with other things that NIGP does? I mean, when you look at like I don't know how much advocacy, lobbying type work you do, other types of value that you provide to your members. Where does learning fit into that portfolio in your mind?
Right. So education has always been the cornerstone. I shouldn't say always been, because the institute was formed in 44, and the first time that we saw curriculum being developed was in the 1970s. So there was about a 25 to 30-year gap, almost half of our history, where education was not the focus. But that actually became part of developing curriculums internally within the context of NIGP, because it wasn't being handled elsewhere. But when we think about the role of a board or a CEO, it's to be mission focused and making sure that the strategies align with that mission. So when we talk about develop, supporting, and promoting public procurement, developing and supporting are the two anchors that deal with professional development and lifelong learning, particularly development. But part of supporting is continuing to provide that education, looking at the research to see what will you need to know in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of the direction of this profession, and then how do we prepare you? So that's both supporting and developing that procurement professional in that next phase of the journey. I mean, the procurement, particularly public procurement, is very much task driven. It's got a series of steps to make sure that the transparency is there, that you're doing things following regulations. And back even in the 80s and 90s, all of that was very paper intensive. And you see how technology has changed the way in which we do business. There's no longer requisitions flowing with 7,000 signatures. That's all done electronically. Contract administration management is done electronically. Payables done electronically. So if a public procurement practitioner learned the paper way of doing things and is not kept to speed in terms of how leveraging technology can make them more efficient, they're actually working behind.
Yeah.
So that's really is our role is to make sure that we continue to hone in on the new skills that folks need in order to be successful in the workplace.
Yeah, I imagine with technology there just has been a huge amount of change. Now, you mentioned in there not only your role but the role of the board, and I do a lot of work with boards. Some I find are somewhat intransigent when it comes to thinking about the type of change that you're describing. But in many cases these days, I find that boards are actually ahead of the curve. They're often the ones pushing the organization to do more with education, with learning, with technology. What was the role of your board in this?
Well, our role really was to make sure that the board understood how that whole development phase, anchored again in the mission, how that is evolving. We have traditionally used kind of a face-to-face or in-person environment, sending individuals to a classroom setting. It could be local, but it could require some traveling requirements to get to a major metropolitan center to go through that education. We realized a couple things with that, although that was a very effective approach, a very traditional approach to education, that we needed to look at how people are learning differently and how they want to be more engaged utilizing technology through distance learning. So working through the board and having them understand that if the strategic initiative is to grow that opportunity for people to continually be on a lifelong learning path, that can happen through a variety of vehicles. Again, traditional classroom setting, or it has to be mirrored within the context of a distance learning environment. We've also learned that even though you go to distance, one of the reasons why we've gone to distance learning and put an emphasis on that is because, this has happened across all sectors, but particularly in the public sector, 2000 to 2008, 9, and 10, and even in 11 were very unfavorable. They were economic crisis periods of time. Where you didn't have any money to send folks to training. Now, money has gotten a little bit better as the economy has improved, But one thing that is not improved is the time that folks have to travel one day to get to a class, to be 3 days out of the office to attend the class, and then get back to the office. They are time starved. So distance learning, where you're doing it from your desktop, whether it's within the context of your normal workday or in the evenings or on weekends, really provides a greater opportunity to plant that availability to learn, but giving it through a variety of medias. So the board has been very, very focused on how do we do this from a strategic standpoint, so that we look at all methods of delivery to get to that end goal of making sure that we continue to develop the procurement professional.
And if you identified, particular areas, particular formats, just ways in which you plan to innovate going forward, I mean, to the extent that you're able to share that kind of inside information.
Well, I think that the one thing that we've picked up is that the delivery, the results of the delivery have to be fairly consistent. And I think that sometimes folks have thought when we are particularly applying distance learning, that you could just kind of put a text up in an ebook. You can do a click and turn, and the person is going to learn the same way that they did when they were interacting with their peers and with an instructor in the classroom, and that's actually not the case. And all the literature points to that as well, that a social framework that allows people to say, hey, how have you done it in the city of or the county of? And you learn from that interaction. That's also got to be built in the context of a distance learning environment that is not a click and turn. With that means that the way in which you are delivering through distance learning has to be as robust, if not even more robust and intentional, because it's more difficult to do. You also have to make sure that your student, the participant who's taking this class, understands that the level of effort to take a distance learning class could even be greater than showing up for 3 days in Cincinnati and sitting in a classroom and having conversations, because it's a lot more intentional.
Right. And have you played a role at all in terms of, getting out there and helping your members understand that, and I guess, in leading your staff in a way that's going to help them build the skills? I mean, I guess what's your role as a leader in kind of making sure that people do embrace these new ways of learning and are going to get, the same or more value out of it?
Right. So you're absolutely right, Jeff. You've got to educate not only your board on how this is the same, but how it is different and how it is mission-centric, but you also have to educate your members on how distance learning is going to be probably more intense, but a greater experience. Part of that is education. So one of the things that we've done on our website is we've asked that's the member the question: do you think you're ready for a distance learning environment as opposed to a face-to-face? And we've kind of built a little template in there where we ask them about 10 or 15 questions.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that basically will come back and say, yeah, you actually, the distance learning is going to work for you. Or it says, you don't know if this is the right fit for you, because in distance learning, X, Y, and Z is going to happen. And people have actually taken that, and it has helped them understand their expectations.
And is that
the other part is,
I was going to say, is that something that's publicly accessible, or do you have to be logged in?
Yeah, it's right on. I believe it's on the NIGP website.
Okay.
On the public side, yes, because we have an area on professional development, and you'll find it there.
I'll make sure we put a link to that up then. Yeah, great.
Sure. The other piece it deals with testimonials. And so we have gleaned a lot of information from our students who have taken a long-distance class, and they have said almost 100% of the time, hey, this was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, and I learned so much more. So education is not an easy process. It's not a quick rote, and then I'm finished. It's the application of the knowledge into a practical experience that's going to make a difference in the environment that they serve. This is actually where public procurement, and I think even in public sector, is a little unique, because when you're in class, whether it's digitally or in a face-to-face setting, People in the public sector are willing to share both the shortcomings and the successes because the person next to them is not a competitor. Unlike in the private sector, you could be working for Ford Motor Company and the procurement agent sitting next to you works for GM. And having that conversation, quite honestly, about how procurement is done and not done and successes and failures is a little bit more uncomfortable. But in the public sector, we share all the warts. And I actually think that dynamic makes education a greater experience in terms of sharing knowledge, sharing experiences, because that's part of that process. It is not just regurgitating, the 10 principles of a public procurement RFP. It is which ones have the most practical relevancy to the work I'm doing.
That is an interesting distinction, the public-private one there, and I think it probably does, as you're saying, help fuel the social interchange that I know has been important to how you think about education there. As we're starting to wrap up here, I want to switch gears a little bit and maybe kind of draw back to sort of the higher big picture level and talk about associations in general. Obviously, providing continuing education and professional development is a key role that associations play in our society, in our economy, and in fact, I've often described associations as being kind of a third leg of our education sector. But it's not a foregone conclusion at this point that associations are going to be capable of maintaining that role. I mean, certainly there are a huge number of new choices out there. Competition is growing. So I'd love to get your perspective as an association leader. What do associations and their leaders need to be doing to ensure that they maintain the leadership role they've traditionally had in lifelong learning?
Yeah, assuming that has been the traditional role, it's very important for association to understand how this part of our delivery has really been transformed through technology because education is so easy to obtain, through a variety of channels, good or bad. And so I think the key is that if it has been a strategy, a priority of the organization, continue to assess how you're going to support that strategy. What I find is that oftentimes associations are really not putting the kinds of resources that they need in order for it to be effective. And that's not only capital resources in terms of buying technologies and making the technology robust and meaningful to the client when they're logging on or where they're going to a class, but also the human capital. How are you supporting that either through your existing staff or contracting through a third party to help you deliver that service? A lot of times we disconnect strategy from resource, and if you uncouple those, you're going to get in trouble because you're probably going to make it a strategy, but you can't make that commitment to identify the resources in order to make it effective. So quite honestly, you put a less than professional product out there, and it really affects the image and the credibility that your organization has. So you've got to couple those two together. I think the other piece is, we talk about competition. Competition is not the worst thing in the world because sometimes you can collaborate with your competitors. The worst thing I think associations do is that they think they need to be all things to all people. And my encouragement is to avoid redundancy. So if you have the best thing out there in terms of education, stick with it. But if the competition has developed something that you don't have, spending the resources, particularly if the competition has something that's exceptional, rather than building resources to compete with it, talk about a collaborative mechanism where you could join forces to provide that education. Because quite honestly, the new generations coming in are less sensitive to brand and are more sensitive to the quality and the end result that they get from the education. So I have seen so many times where CEOs, boards panic, oh my goodness, our competing organization over here is building it. We've got to build a better mousetrap. No, I think that you want to avoid redundancy and consider collaboration. One of the things that we've done is because there's nuances, there's new little techniques those are some of the soft skills that are coming into public procurement. Rather than us building that internally, we have partnered with subject matter experts who have developed the content and are delivering the content both in a face-to-face environment and through distance learning. And so we're relying on them to develop that quality, to develop that courseware, and then we're co-sponsoring, we're co-branding it with them, rather than us spending the resource. And yet it still gets to the point of the member being able to go through a lifelong learning experience, which is actually our objective. So we continue to think that we have to do all of this stuff in-house, and that's actually not the case.
Yeah,
we do have to orchestrate it, though.
You do have to, yeah. Well, and I think that's a great example. I'm personally very high on collaboration right now, and I think what you're doing, even in working with universities, because in many ways, I mean, universities are really gearing up what they're doing in the realm of continuing education. I mean, they've always been there, but I think they're thinking more and more about it and investing more in it, and are going to be more direct competitors, I think, with a lot of associations. But I think there's just such fertile ground for collaboration with universities among a range of different partners that are out there. So it's interesting to find out at the beginning of this that's something you're really focusing on.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up here, one thing we always like to ask folks on the Leading Learning podcast is, what are some of your own approaches to lifelong learning? What are some of your lifelong learning habits?
Well, Jeff, I would say the number one rule is you don't know what you don't know. So if you continue to evolve utilizing the same data inputs into your own professional life, you're going to end up with the same kind of stuff that you've been doing for 10, 15 years. You've got to go out there and really ask the hard questions about what you're doing as an organization, what you're doing as a professional. Continue to do the research. Because I think, particularly as a CEO, your role is to help facilitate and guide your board into the right decisions. That it is a partnership between the CEO and the executive staff and the board as they work together to implement the mission. So I've always really emphasized the asking the hard questions, seeking out stakeholders, looking for diversity of thought, researching new approaches and innovations. As a matter of fact, we've done a fair amount of work just on restructuring our governance model. We did it because we read a piece of research about relevancy of associations in the new normal, and we said, boy, that could be us if we don't start doing things differently and innovate and become relevant. And I think particularly to this point of education, relevancy is going to be critical as a greatly competing environment, again, with universities and with their associations. How do we stay on top of that curve? And so you have to kind of look at how, delivery points, how you're delivering, how you're leveraging technology to get it in. And I think that the CEO has that responsibility to continue to, ask those hard questions and then share that information with the board and say, hey, we haven't thought about this. What do you think?
Well, great. And I know you are someone who does that. So, Rick, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the show here. Before we wrap up, how can folks best find out about NIGP and possibly even follow up with you if they happen to have questions or just want to pick your brain a little bit about some of the things you've said?
Absolutely. So obviously visit our website at nigp.org. Quite honestly, talking about technology, it has some limitations. Therefore, we have invested, going back to the strategy and investment, we have invested in a new content management system that will come online in December. And it will be a lot more robust at that point as well. You can also reach me easy. It's Grimm, as in fairy tales, RGRIMM, at nigp.org. We're here as colleagues, serving associations. So please ask the questions. You can reach me on several of the communities within the ASAE as well. I think that's how we learn from each other, and we always get better day by day by sharing knowledge.
Well, great. Well, Rick, thanks so much for taking the time to share your perspectives and insights.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
So that wraps up the interview with Rick Grimm. To get show notes for this episode, go to leadinglearning.com/episode 4. That's episode and the number 4. And while you're there, you'll see various options for subscribing to the podcast. And if you're getting value out of the podcast, we would be truly grateful if you would subscribe. We'd also be really grateful if you would take a minute to give us a rating on iTunes. You go to leadinglearning.com/iTunes, and this really does make a difference. It makes it a lot easier for other people to find this podcast.
And we certainly hope a lot of people will find the podcast. So in addition to doing the iTunes thing, we'd really be grateful if you'd consider telling other people about the Leading Learning podcast. To do that, one very easy way just to be able to send out a tweet is by going to leadinglearning.com/share. And if you do that, it'll just pop up a tweet that's already pre-filled with some content for you. And all you got to do is click send to tweet that out to the world. If you're not into tweeting, pick another social network of your choice and just spread the word.
So thanks again, and we'll see you next time on the Leading Learning Podcast.